Sometimes the smallest, weakest thing in the auction ring carries a destiny bigger than the richest man in town could ever imagine. The wind rolled hard across the dry Oklahoma plains, dragging dust through the cracked boards of Grayson County's livestock barn like the breath of an old ghost. Beneath a pale October sky, men in pressed hats and polished boots gathered with folded arms, watching horses circle through the sale ring with the cold eyes of businessmen measuring profit in muscle and bloodline. Caleb Dawson stood near the back rail, his weathered hat pulled low, his coat frayed at the cuffs, and exactly 50 cents resting in his calloused palm. At 39, Caleb looked older than his years, worn thin by drought, unpaid bank notices, and too many silent nights in a ranch house that had felt empty ever since his wife passed 3 winters before. His land outside Broken Ridge was dying inch by inch beneath the relentless sun, and by Friday, the bank intended to take what little remained. He hadn't come to the auction expecting salvation. Men like Caleb no longer believed in miracles. He came hoping for cheap feed, maybe old tack, anything to stretch survival one more season. But then the foal entered the ring. She was so small the crowd barely noticed her at first. A frail chestnut filly with knobby knees, tangled mare, and ribs faint beneath her dusty coat, she trembled under the harsh clang of the auction gate. Her thin legs looked too delicate for the world she'd been thrown into, and her wide amber eyes searched the roaring barn not with fear alone, but with something deeper. Something stubborn. Something unbroken. Laughter spread quickly through the crowd. "That runt won't last till Christmas," one rancher muttered. "Worth more as coyote bait," another sneered. Even the auctioneer's voice carried little confidence as he adjusted his hat and called for an opening bid. $50. Silence. 20. More silence. 5. Nothing. The little filly stood alone beneath the buzzing lights, her ears twitching at every cruel chuckle, her tiny frame shaking as though the whole world had already decided she was worthless. Caleb felt something twist. Deep in his chest. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was the painful recognition of another soul standing one breath away from being discarded. The auctioneer sighed, glancing around the room. 50 cents, then. Anyone? For a long second, only wind answered. Then Caleb raised his hand. The barn erupted in laughter so loud it rattled the metal rafters overhead. Heads turned. Men grinned. Someone slapped a rail and barked, "Dawson's finally lost his mind." But Caleb didn't flinch. He stepped forward, pressed his last 2 quarters onto the scarred wooden table, and looked directly at the trembling foal. "Sold," the auctioneer muttered. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. And in that single sound, Caleb Dawson unknowingly bought far more than a starving horse. He bought the first fragile thread of a future no one in a dusty barn could yet imagine. As he took the rope gently into his rough hands, the tiny filly lifted her head, her dark eyes meeting his for the first time. And somehow, beneath all the laughter, all the dust, and all the ruin, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The trailer rattled behind Caleb Dawson's aging Ford pickup as the long dirt road stretched west beneath a sky bruised purple by the coming evening. Dry grass bent beneath the endless Oklahoma wind, whispering through rusted fence lines and skeletal mesquite trees as though the land itself had forgotten how to hope. Inside the small wooden trailer, the fragile foal shifted uncertainly, her tiny hooves scraping softly against warped planks with every jolt of the road. Caleb kept one hand steady on the wheel, his other resting near the open window where cool air carried dust, sage, and the faint scent of distant rain that rarely came. He had not spoken much since leaving the auction. Words had become expensive over the years, and survival often required silence. Still, every few miles, he glanced back through the cracked rearview mirror, checking on the small chestnut figure whose fate had somehow become tied to his own. By the time the truck reached Dawson Ranch, dusk had settled over the property like a worn blanket. The ranch sat on 100 battered acres just outside Broken Ridge, though most of it had long since surrendered to drought. The barn leaned slightly east from years of storm winds. Fence posts sagged. Paint peeled from the old farmhouse in strips, exposing grey timber weathered by decades of hard seasons. It was not much anymore, but it was still home. Caleb killed the engine, and silence spread across the yard except for the distant creak of an old windmill turning slow against the darkening horizon. He stepped from the truck, boots crunching on dry gravel, and carefully opened the trailer gate. The little foal hesitated, her thin body trembling beneath the fading light. Up close, Caleb could see just how fragile she truly was. Her coat, once likely rich chestnut, had dulled beneath dirt and neglect. Her mane hung in wild knots. Yet her eye still held that same impossible spark, soft but defiant. "Come on, girl," Caleb murmured, his voice low and steady. "You are home now." The foal blinked, uncertain, but after a long moment, she stepped forward. One shaky hoof. Then another. Caleb did not pull. He simply walked beside her, offering patience instead of force. From the porch, his 12-year-old daughter, Emma Dawson, stood wrapped in a faded denim jacket, her blonde hair tousled by the wind. She stared in disbelief. "Dad," she said softly, "you spent money we do not have, on that." Caleb paused, his weathered face softening. Sometimes what looks broken just needs a fair chance. Emma frowned, though not out of cruelty. Life had simply taught her caution too early. She followed in silence as Caleb guided the foal into the old barn's cleanest stall, where fresh hay had been spread beneath a patched lantern glow. The filly lowered her head cautiously, breathing in the unfamiliar scent of safety. Caleb filled a water trough, then gently brushed trembling fingers along her narrow neck. "Belle," he whispered after a long pause. Emma tilted her head. "Belle?" Caleb nodded. Because even the smallest things can carry beauty. Outside, the first stars began appearing over the plains, scattered like silver promises above broken land. Inside that weathered barn, with dust drifting golden. Through lantern light, one bankrupt rancher and one forgotten foal stood side by side. Neither of them knew it yet, but this crumbling ranch was no longer a place where dreams came to die. It had just become the beginning of something extraordinary. Morning arrived slowly over Dawson Ranch, spilling pale gold across the brittle fields and weathered fence posts like mercy poured over old scars. The wind carried its usual dry bite, but inside the barn, something softer had begun to grow. Belle stood beneath the warm shafts of sunlight that slipped through cracked wooden slats, her fragile frame still thin but steadier now, her chestnut coat slowly revealing hints of hidden shine beneath layers of dust and neglect. Caleb Dawson moved quietly through the stall, his worn boots brushing straw aside as he carried fresh water and feed each dawn before the rest of the world stirred awake. Routine had become survival long ago, but now it was becoming something more. Healing. Every morning, Belle greeted him with cautious eyes and flicking ears, her fear slowly giving way to trust. Caleb never rushed her. He understood too well that broken things did not heal through force. They healed through patience. Through consistency. Through quiet kindness offered day after day, even when the future remained uncertain. Emma watched it all from the barn doorway, her skepticism gradually softening into curiosity. At first, she had expected the tiny foal to fade, another burden too fragile for the harsh realities of their life. But Belle surprised them both. Though still small for her age, she carried herself with increasing determination. Her legs strengthened. Her breathing deepened. And sometimes, when Caleb opened the pasture gate at sunrise, Belle would kick up her heels and run awkward, joyful circles through the amber grass, as though some buried wildness was awakening beneath her delicate form. "She has got fight," Emma whispered one morning, leaning against the rail as Belle trotted past. Caleb allowed himself the smallest smile. "That she does." As autumn deepened, their bond grew stronger in ways words could barely explain. Belle began following Caleb like a shadow, her tiny hooves crunching faithfully behind him as he repaired fences, checked dry wells, or hauled feed. She learned the sound of his whistle, the rhythm of his boots, the calm steadiness in his voice. And Caleb, in turn, found pieces of himself returning that grief had nearly buried for good. For the first time since his wife's passing, laughter occasionally echoed through the ranch again, carried by Emma's brighter smile and Belle's playful energy. Yet beneath the healing, signs of mystery quietly emerged. One crisp afternoon, while brushing Belle's tangled coat near her shoulder, Caleb's worn hand paused. Beneath the dirt and chestnut fur lay a faded brand, nearly invisible but unmistakably deliberate. He narrowed his eyes. This was no ordinary stray marking. The symbol was old, elegant, and professionally done, belonging not to common livestock but to bloodlines of value. "Emma," Caleb called softly. "Come look at this." She knelt beside him, tracing the shape with careful fingers. "What does it mean?" Caleb's jaw tightened as he studied it. "It means someone once believed she was worth something." The realization settled heavily in the barn's golden silence. Belle had not simply been neglected. She had a past. One hidden beneath starvation and dust. And perhaps, just perhaps, a future far greater than anyone in Broken Ridge could imagine. As the Oklahoma sun dipped low beyond the fields, painting the horizon in copper and fire, Belle lifted her head into the wind, her dark eyes fixed westward with a quiet strength that sent an unfamiliar spark through Caleb's weary heart. For the first time in years, he was no longer merely surviving the days ahead. He was beginning to believe that destiny itself might be standing in his barn. The first frost of November settled lightly over Dawson Ranch, silvering the brittle pasture grass and stretching cold silence across the Oklahoma plains. Morning came sharp and clean, carrying the scent of cedar smoke, dry earth, and winter's slow approach. Belle had grown stronger with each passing week, her once fragile frame now lean with young muscle, her chestnut coat beginning to gleam beneath careful brushing and steady care. Though still smaller than most foals her age, there was a grace emerging in her movement that no one could ignore. She no longer stumbled uncertainly through the pasture. She moved with purpose. With pride. Caleb Dawson noticed it every day, but on that particular morning, fate chose to send someone else down the long dirt road to notice it too. The sound of tires crunching gravel broke the ranch's familiar quiet as an old ranch truck rolled through the front gate. Behind the wheel sat Walter Bennett, a retired horse breeder and former quarter horse trainer whose name still carried weight across 3 counties. At 71, Walter's back was bent, his beard silvered, and his weathered hand shook slightly from age, but his eyes remained sharp as cut glass when it came to horses. He had known Caleb's late father and occasionally stopped by to check on the struggling ranch, though rarely with optimism. Stepping from his truck, Walter adjusted his hat against the wind and exchanged a quiet nod with Caleb before his gaze shifted toward the pasture. Belle stood near the far fence line, her small silhouette painted gold beneath the rising sun. For a long moment, Walter said nothing. Then his expression changed. "Good Lord," he muttered under his breath. Caleb frowned. "What is it?" Walter walked slowly toward Belle, his old boots brushing frost from the grass. Belle, usually cautious with strangers, watched him carefully but did not retreat. Walter's eyes narrowed as he studied her stance, her shoulders, the elegant slope of her neck, and finally, the faded brand beneath her coat. His weathered fingers brushed gently over the mark, and his breath caught. "Caleb," he said, his voice lower now, touched with disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you bought for 50 cents? Caleb remained silent. Walter stepped back, his eyes still locked on Belle as though staring at a ghost from another lifetime. "This filly, she carries the Blackwood line." The words hung in the cold air like thunder before a storm. Caleb's brow furrowed. Every rancher in Oklahoma knew the Blackwood bloodline. It was legendary. A rare line of quarter horses known for extraordinary speed, intelligence, and championship breeding, worth fortunes to the right buyers. Horses from Blackwood stock had not only dominated tracks and breeding programs for decades, but many sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. "That cannot be possible," Caleb said quietly. Walter shook his head. "I trained against her sire 20 years ago. I would know that brand anywhere." Emma stood speechless near the barn fence, her blue eyes wide with wonder. The tiny foal they had saved from ridicule and neglect was not worthless. She was valuable beyond anything they had imagined. More than that, she was rare. Caleb looked at Belle differently now, though not with greed. With awe. He had seen something precious in her from the beginning, but now the truth stretched far beyond simple compassion. Belle was not merely surviving. She had been born for greatness. As the winter wind swept across the open fields, Belle lifted her head high, her mane dancing softly in the morning light. In that breathtaking moment, standing on dying land beside a bankrupt rancher, the forgotten foal no one wanted no longer looked small at all. She looked like destiny. Winter settled harder over Broken Ridge as December wind swept across Dawson Ranch with sharp teeth, rattling barn doors and stripping the last stubborn leaves from cottonwoods along the dry creek bed. The fields lay brittle and pale beneath iron skies, and every sunrise seemed to bring new reminders that survival remained a fragile thing. Though Belle's true bloodline had been revealed, legacy alone did not pay overdue bills. Caleb Dawson still faced the same brutal deadline. The bank's final notice sat folded on his kitchen table, its edges softened only by repeated handling. By New Year's Day, unless he could produce enough money to cover his debts, Dawson Ranch would no longer belong to his family. Belle had become a spark of hope, but hope was not yet enough. Word of the Blackwood filly spread quickly through county lines, carried by feed stores, auction barns, and ranchers whose ears sharpened whenever rare bloodlines were mentioned. It did not take long before opportunity arrived, wearing polished boots and a costly wool coat. Richard Holloway, one of the wealthiest ranch owners in Oklahoma, pulled into Caleb's yard just days before Christmas in a gleaming black truck that looked out of place against the weathered barns and rusted gates. Holloway was a man whose fortune had been built on cattle, racing stock, and knowing exactly how to profit from another man's desperation. Tall, silver-haired, and carrying the smooth confidence of someone rarely told no, Richard stepped onto the porch with a leather briefcase in hand and a smile too polished to trust. Caleb met him at the door, wary but respectful. "Mr. Dawson," Holloway said warmly, glancing toward Belle's pasture where the young filly now moved with growing elegance despite winter's bite. "I hear you have something extraordinary." Caleb remained silent. Holloway opened the briefcase and revealed papers alongside a certified check. $100,000, he said plainly. Emma, standing just inside the doorway, gasped softly. It was more money than Caleb had seen in his lifetime. Enough to erase debt. Enough to repair the ranch. Enough to guarantee security. Holloway's smile widened slightly. For the filly. Today. The wind outside seemed to still as the offer settled into the room. Caleb looked through the frost-covered window toward Belle, who stood beneath the grey sky with her small but proud silhouette framed against the dying pasture. $100,000 could save everything. It could buy comfort, stability, and certainty. Yet as Caleb stared at Belle, he no longer saw a transaction. He saw the trembling foal no one wanted. The creature he had chosen not because of profit, but because he understood what it meant to be discarded. Belle had not simply revived his finances. She had revived something far more fragile. His faith. Caleb slowly closed the briefcase and pushed it back toward Holloway. "No, sir," he said quietly. Richard blinked, clearly unaccustomed to refusal. "You understand what you are turning down?" Caleb nodded. "I do." His weathered hand rested on the porch rail as his gaze remained fixed on Belle. "Some things are worth more than money." Holloway's expression hardened, though only slightly. "You are making an emotional mistake." Caleb's voice remained calm, steady as old oak. "Maybe. But she is not for sale." Richard left without another word, his truck disappearing down the long gravel road beneath gathering snow clouds. Emma stepped beside her father, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, that was enough to save us." Caleb looked toward Belle, who suddenly kicked her heels high into the winter wind, fierce and free despite the cold. "No," he said softly. "She is going to do far more than that." And for the first time, Caleb Dawson was no longer betting on survival alone. He was betting on destiny. January arrived with bitter winds and hard blue skies stretched wide above Dawson Ranch, but beneath winter's harsh grip, something remarkable had begun to bloom. Snow dusted the pasture in thin silver streaks, gathering along fence posts and barn roofs, while each sunrise painted the frozen plains in pale gold and amber. Caleb Dawson rose before dawn every morning, his breath visible in the cold as he crossed the brittle yard with saddle blankets, feed buckets, and quiet determination. Belle was no longer the trembling 50-cent foal that had once staggered from an auction pen beneath laughter. She was growing into herself now. Her chestnut coat had deepened into a rich burnished copper, gleaming even beneath winter's muted light. Her legs, once uncertain and delicate, had lengthened with surprising strength. More importantly, the fire inside her had only sharpened. Caleb began her training slowly, not as wealthy breeders might with polished arenas and expensive handlers, but with the patient wisdom of a rancher who understood trust before technique. He worked her from the round pen first, teaching her voice commands, rhythm, and responsiveness. Belle learned quickly, almost astonishingly so. She did not merely obey. She anticipated. Her instinct seemed unusually sharp, her focus intense, as though generations of champion blood had awakened fully beneath Dawson care. Walter Bennett visited often, watching from the fence rail with narrowed eyes and quiet amazement. "She is special, Caleb," he said one frigid morning as Belle cut tight circles through fresh snow. "With astonishing grace. Not just pedigree. Heart." Caleb, his gloved hands resting against the wooden rail, nodded slowly. "I know." By February, Belle had advanced beyond simple groundwork. Caleb introduced her to speed drills across the open pasture, where old fence lines stretched for acres beneath endless sky. Though still young, Belle moved with breathtaking fluidity. Her stride was powerful, her turns precise, and her endurance far beyond what anyone expected from such humble beginnings. Emma often stood near the barn, bundled in her winter coat, cheering as Belle thundered across frosted fields, her mare catching sunlight like flame. For the first time in years, laughter became common at Dawson Ranch. Yet outside their land, skepticism remained. Broken Ridge had not forgotten Belle's origins, and many townsfolk still viewed Caleb's dreams as little more than poor man's fantasy. Men at feed stores chuckled when they heard whispers that Caleb intended to enter Belle in spring showcase events. "That little auction runt," they scoffed. "He is chasing fairy tales." But Caleb had lived long enough to know that the world often mocked what it failed to understand. He ignored them. Every dollar he could spare went toward proper feed, veterinary care, and training equipment. Sacrifice became routine. Some nights, Caleb skipped meals so Belle's regimen would not suffer. He did not speak of it. Emma noticed anyway. One late evening, while lantern light flickered softly across the barn, Emma watched Belle nuzzle Caleb's shoulder with surprising gentleness after an exhausting training session. "She trusts you," Emma whispered. Caleb stroked Belle's neck, his weathered expression softened by something deeper than pride. "No," he said quietly. "We trust each other." As winter slowly surrendered to hints of spring, Belle stood stronger, faster, and more extraordinary with each passing day. Her muscles had sharpened. Her confidence had blossomed. The forgotten foal once sold for pocket change was becoming something no one in Broken Ridge could ignore much longer. Beneath the vast American sky, on a ranch once marked for ruin, Caleb Dawson was not simply training a horse. He was preparing a miracle. Spring came hard and bright across Oklahoma, sweeping winter's last frost from the plains and breathing new life into Dawson Ranch. Wild grass pushed green through brittle earth, cottonwoods budded along the creek bed, and beneath the widening blue skies, Belle had transformed into something breathtaking. At just over 2 years old, she was no longer the fragile filly rescued from ridicule. Her once small frame had grown sleek and athletic, every stride carrying power, elegance, and impossible determination. Her chestnut coat shone like polished copper beneath the sun, and when she ran, it was as though the wind itself had chosen to follow. Word of Belle's astonishing progress had spread far beyond Broken Ridge, eventually reaching organizers of the Oklahoma Rising Star Showcase, one of the region's most respected events for young quarter horses. It was not yet the grand championship circuits, but it was a proving ground where bloodlines were tested, futures were forged, and wealthy breeders watched closely. Walter Bennett had urged Caleb for weeks. "This is her shot," he said firmly. "And yours." Caleb knew the risks. Entry fees were steep. Travel would strain their already fragile finances. failure would bring fresh mockery from every man who had ever laughed at his 50-cent gamble. But Caleb Dawson had not fought this farm merely to survive. He entered Bell. The morning of the showcase, Caleb's battered truck rolled into Tulsa County Fairgrounds beneath golden dawn light. Expensive trailers lined the grounds, gleaming with polished chrome and custom paint. Wealthy ranchers led pristine horses bred from million-dollar programs. Men in tailored jackets and women in crisp boots exchanged confident smiles over steaming coffee. Caleb's weathered pickup and homemade trailer drew more than a few sideways glances. "Looks like somebody brought a pasture pet," one breeder muttered under his breath. Emma heard it and clenched her jaw, but Caleb simply rested a steady hand on Belle's neck. "Let them talk," he said softly. Belle stepped from the trailer with calm, alert grace, her dark eyes bright beneath the morning sun. Heads turned almost immediately. Even among elite stock, her presence was undeniable. Small compared to some, yes, but perfectly balanced. Sharp. Focused. Richard Holloway himself stood among the crowd, his silver stare narrowing with visible surprise. He had expected Caleb's refusal to end in regret, not revelation. As preliminary runs began, Belle exceeded every expectation. Her agility was unmatched. Her acceleration stunned seasoned judges. Each turn was crisp, each command answered with instinctive brilliance. Murmurs spread quickly through the stands. By the time Belle qualified for the final showcase run, laughter had vanished entirely. Then came the final sprint. The air itself seemed to hold still as Caleb guided Belle to the starting line. His weathered hand brushed her neck one final time. "You were born for this," he whispered. The gate opened. Belle exploded forward like lightning unleashed. Her stride devoured the ground with astonishing precision, each movement a breathtaking blend of speed and heart. Dust rose behind her in golden clouds as spectators surged to their feet. Wealthy breeders stood speechless. Judges leaned forward. Emma's hands trembled with hope. And when Belle crossed the finish line, not merely victorious but dominant, the scoreboard confirmed what Caleb had believed from the beginning. First place. Silence struck for one impossible second before the grandstands erupted in thunderous applause. Caleb removed his hat slowly, emotion tightening his throat as Belle's breath rose warm beneath his hand. In a world that had once priced her at 50 cents, Belle had just proven herself priceless. And standing beneath the roaring Oklahoma sky, a broke rancher from Broken Ridge realized that destiny had not merely arrived at his barn. It had just outrun the world. Victory at Tulsa did not simply change Belle's future. It shattered every limit the world had once placed on Caleb Dawson's life. By the time father and daughter returned to Broken Ridge, word had already outrun them. Feed stores buzzed. Local papers ran stories about the 50-cent filly with champion blood. Breeders, investors, and ranchers from across Oklahoma and Texas began calling Dawson ranch with offers that would have once sounded impossible to a man who had nearly lost everything. Belle was no longer an overlooked foal from a dusty auction ring. She had become one of the most sought-after young mares in the region. Spring bled into summer, and with each event Belle entered, her legend only grew. She continued winning showcase circuits, speed trials, and breeding evaluations with remarkable consistency, combining Blackwood pedigree with the grit and resilience forged on broken land. Wealthy buyers arrived in polished trucks, offering sums Caleb could scarcely comprehend. $200,000. $500,000. Exclusive breeding contracts. Sponsorships. Magazine features. Yet Caleb remained steady. He did not rush. Walter Bennett advised carefully, helping Caleb navigate contracts that would preserve Belle's long-term value while protecting her welfare. Instead of selling her outright, Caleb made the decision that would change everything. He retained ownership and entered Belle into elite breeding and competition partnerships under Dawson Ranch's name. It was a gamble few expected from a once bankrupt rancher, but Caleb understood something wealthier men often forgot. Belle was not merely a quick payout. She was legacy. Within 2 years, Bell's championship record and exceptional offspring transformed Dawson Ranch from near foreclosure into one of the fastest rising breeding operations in the state. The same land once marked for repossession was revitalized with new fencing, restored barns, healthy pasture rotation, and modern facilities. Caleb paid every cent of his debt in full. Then he bought back neighboring acreage that drought and desperation had once forced other struggling ranchers to abandon. Emma, now older and wiser beyond her years, became an essential part of the ranch's future, learning bloodline management, training, and operations alongside her father. The broken ranch house was repaired, though Caleb insisted on keeping its original front porch untouched as a reminder of where they began. Richard Holloway, once so certain Caleb would fail, returned one final time with a multi-million-dollar acquisition offer for Bell and her line. Caleb declined again, though this time with quiet confidence rather than desperation. "She already made me richer than money ever could," he said. And it was true. Financially, Bell had made Caleb Dawson a millionaire many times over. But her true gift reached deeper. She had restored dignity, family, purpose. She had turned a grieving widower into a respected ranch owner, a struggling child into a future horsewoman, and a forgotten piece of land into a place of second chances. On warm summer evenings, as the Oklahoma sun dipped low across endless golden pasture, Caleb would often stand by the fence line, watching Bell run freely with her foals beneath skies painted in fire and amber. Her manner still caught the wind the same way it had on the day he first chose her. Strong, fearless, unbroken. Visitors often asked Caleb how he had known that one starving little foal was worth betting everything on. He would simply smile beneath the brim of his weathered hat and say, "I did not buy her because I thought she would make me rich. I bought her because she deserved a chance." And perhaps that was the true miracle after all. Because sometimes, when the world sees only 50 cents, faith can still recognize a $1 million destiny. Years passed across Dawson Ranch like seasons written by grace itself. The once broken land outside Broken Ridge had become something few could have imagined in those desperate days of drought and foreclosure. Green pastures rolled beneath broad Oklahoma skies, healthy foals raced through strong wooden fences, and restored barns stood tall against sunsets that seemed almost too beautiful for memory alone. Dawson Ranch was no longer a symbol of survival. It had become a symbol of redemption. Bell's bloodline flourished beyond anything even Walter Bennett had predicted. Her offspring carried her rare balance of speed, intelligence, and spirit, earning championships and national recognition that elevated Dawson Ranch into one of America's most respected names in quarter horse breeding. Wealth, once an impossible dream, had become security not just for Caleb and Emma, but for generations to come. Yet for Caleb Dawson, true success had never been measured by bank accounts, trophies, or polished magazine covers. It was measured in what he chose to do with the miracle he had been given. Rather than hoarding fortune, Caleb began purchasing neglected horses from auctions across the Midwest, often paying for animals others had dismissed as broken, aging, or worthless. He restored them on the very ranch Bell had saved, creating a sanctuary for forgotten horses and struggling ranch families alike. Men and women facing foreclosure found work and hope there. Children learned to ride, heal, and trust again among creatures the world had nearly discarded. Emma, now a strong young woman with her mother's kindness and her father's quiet resilience, helped lead these efforts, ensuring Dawson Ranch became more than a business. It became a refuge. Visitors often came from far beyond Oklahoma just to witness Bell, the legendary mare whose journey from 50-cent mockery to $1 million legacy had inspired countless hearts. Though older now, Bell still moved through the fields with that same graceful fire, her chestnut coat glowing beneath the western sun, her eyes bright with the spirit that had never once surrendered. Caleb often visited her favorite pasture at dusk, where the wind rolled soft through prairie grass and the horizon burned gold, crimson, and violet. There, beneath the endless American sky, he would rest one weathered hand against her neck and remember the day he had stood in a dusty auction barn with only 50 cents left to his name. A poor rancher. A forgotten foal. A single impossible choice. Emma once asked him, as they watched Bell's grandchildren thunder freely through summer fields, "Did you ever imagine any of this?" Caleb smiled, his lined face softened by gratitude more than age. "No," he admitted. "But I learned something." Emma glanced toward him. Caleb's gaze remained fixed on the horses running beneath the setting sun. Sometimes God hides the greatest blessings inside the smallest chances. And so Dawson Ranch's story became more than local legend. It became living proof that compassion can rewrite destiny, that faith can outlast ruin, and that even the weakest. Life can carry extraordinary power when someone chooses to believe instead of walk away. As evening settled softly over the land Belle had transformed, Caleb removed his hat, letting the prairie wind move through silvering hair, while beside him stood the horse who had not only made him a millionaire, but had restored everything money alone never could. Because in the end, the world had seen a starving foal worth 50 cents. But one broke rancher had seen a miracle. And sometimes, that is all it takes to change everything.